My name is Olivia Bennett. I'm 31, and until last week, I believed grief could bring families together. I was wrong. The shift happened immediately after my grandfather's funeral. People were still leaving the cemetery when my father received confirmation that he had inherited $60 million. I watched him, expecting relief, or maybe even a flicker of sadness, but what I saw instead was something colder, a calculating satisfaction, as if he had been waiting for this moment his whole life. It wasn't until we arrived at the house, the home I had lived in for decades, that the meaning of that expression became clear. He looked at me directly, his voice firm, stripped of any warmth. "You're useless now." He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't pause. He didn't hesitate. He told me to pack my things, and the words landed like a hammer. Within moments, I was on the porch with 2 bags, a lifetime of memories compressed into fabric and plastic. The front door clicked shut behind me, final and absolute. At the time, I didn't understand the full consequences. But the next morning, a lawyer would look my father in the eye and ask, almost with amusement, "Did you even read the will?" That question alone would start unraveling everything he thought he owned. A few days before, life had followed a predictable rhythm. Calm, steady, slow. I had grown used to it. That calm allowed me to notice the contrasts that defined my family for decades. Samuel Grant, my grandfather, had raised me in ways no one else had. He believed in responsibility, quiet strength, and giving more than you took. His values shaped my childhood because he actually lived them. My mother passed away when I was young, leaving a void that sharpened the edges of my father, Robert Bennett. Robert never learned to sit with emotions. Instead, he buried himself in ambition, convinced success could earn the respect he felt denied. He built a life of numbers, calculations, and distant gestures, rarely noticing the impact on those closest to him. Then there was my sister, Taylor. She inherited my father's competitiveness, always measuring herself against me, tallying invisible points, seeking approval in ways I never could, or wanted to. In a house where affection was scarce, I became the easy target. Samuel saw all of this. He never tried to change my sister or my father. But he nurtured me. He encouraged curiosity, patience, and empathy, qualities that might have withered under my father's rigid calculations. When school became overwhelming or the home atmosphere grew tense, Samuel would take me on long drives through the quieter corners of Massachusetts. He told me stories from his construction days, tales of resilience that required stubbornness and quiet effort. Those drives shaped who I became far more than any classroom lesson. The distance between my father and me grew over the years. Robert had a map for his life, and I wasn't on it unless I served some purpose. Taylor, of course, adapted. She mirrored his cues, chasing approval and measuring success by his acknowledgement. I did neither, which made me less valuable. Yet, I believed families could bridge fractures. I believed in consistency over shortcuts. So when Samuel's health began to fail, stepping in felt natural. I rearranged my work, shortened client calls, and became his companion through the final chapters of his life. It wasn't a burden. It was a privilege. Samuel never complained. His mind remained sharp even as his body weakened. He spoke of his past with clarity, sharing lessons that anchored me. Listening to him strengthened something in me, but it also revealed my father's absence more starkly. Robert appeared only when discussions turned to assets, business holdings, and future plans. His interest was calculation, not care. Taylor mirrored him. She appeared suddenly with helpful offers that always centered on financial paperwork or documents she had no authority to manage. Their visits were not acts of love, they were strategic maneuvers, each step calculated for advantage. Samuel noticed. In the quiet moments we shared, he asked not about money or conflict, but about my feelings, my plans, my ability to navigate life. At the time, I thought he was preparing me emotionally. In reality, he was preparing me for a future he had already mapped out carefully. The final months before his passing revealed more about my family than 30 years had. Robert's attentiveness increased, focused entirely on control of the company. Taylor acted as if proximity alone entitled her influence. I watched, a silent witness, as their strategies unfolded. Meanwhile, my bond with Samuel deepened. Caring for him wasn't a chore. It was trust. It was love. And as he weakened, professionals came in, nurses, therapists, social workers, but I remained the constant. Each small act of care I offered was an anchor, not just for him, but for me. Even then, I didn't fully understand the careful preparation Samuel was doing, setting a foundation that would alter everything after he was gone. The day after my grandfather's funeral began in a fog. I woke to the quiet hum of the city, a world that seemed unchanged even though mine had tilted on its axis. My phone buzzed with messages I wasn't prepared to read. Among them, one stood out, a short request from Eric Monroe, my grandfather's attorney, asking me to call at my earliest convenience. I wasn't sure why. I hadn't expected anything. My father had inherited everything, or so I thought. The morning passed in a strange suspension. I walked through the house where I had grown up, now quiet and foreign. Boxes appeared near the doorway, as if my father had anticipated my exit. Minutes later, he arrived, accompanied by Taylor. Their presence was sharp, purposeful, and devoid of warmth. He didn't explain, didn't negotiate, didn't soften. He told me I had lived there long enough. It was time to leave, so he could manage the estate efficiently. The words hit me with the weight of inevitability. I gathered what I could, a few personal belongings, clothes, documents, a lifetime of small things that had defined my life. Every step toward the door felt heavier than the last, my hands trembling despite the control I tried to hold. Outside, 2 men in security jackets waited. They weren't hostile. They didn't need to be. Their silence and firmness said everything my father refused to articulate: you are being removed, and there is nothing you can do about it. The door closed behind me, final and definitive. For hours, I wandered, suitcase in hand, the reality settling with every step. I didn't have a plan, only the lingering confusion of betrayal. And then, the phone rang. It was Eric. Calm, measured, his voice carried the weight of authority and reassurance simultaneously. He asked me to come to his office. When I arrived at Monroe and Associates, the polished glass tower reflected a version of myself I barely recognized, tired, unsteady, unsure. The receptionist directed me to a small private room, warmer than the conference hall used for the formal reading. Eric entered, closing the door behind him. His demeanor was different, less formal, more human. He asked if I was all right. It was the first moment since the funeral that someone had asked about me, not the estate. I nodded, though my voice felt distant even to my own ears. He opened a folder and slid it across the table. It was the same one we had reviewed hours earlier, but now, certain clauses were highlighted in careful strokes of blue ink. This, he said, is what the primary reading doesn't show. Your grandfather prepared contingencies for circumstances like today. I read, trying to make sense of each word. According to Eric, the inheritance granted to my father was conditional. Every asset, every account, every property depended on his continued support for me: safe housing, financial stability, protection from undue hardship. The clause was precise, legal, but also deeply personal. It was clear, if he failed in his responsibilities, the entire inheritance could be redirected to an alternate beneficiary. Eric's expression stayed calm, but I could feel the weight behind his words. Then he slid a second document across the table. This one bore my grandfather's signature and notarization. The alternate beneficiary, recorded in a sealed annex, was me. I blinked, unsure if I had understood correctly. The eviction, the humiliation, the finality of the door closing behind me, it wasn't just a cruel act. It had triggered a legal safeguard Samuel had designed with foresight only he could possess. Eric explained the process. Full ownership wouldn't transfer immediately. There were formalities, board notifications, audits, compliance checks. But operational authority, the right to oversee the estate, to receive updates, and to prevent further harm, was now temporarily mine. I was stunned. I wasn't being handed wealth as a reward. I was being entrusted with responsibility, protection, and the authority to ensure my father could not exploit what he believed he had won. When I left the office, the world felt the same, yet entirely changed. Every familiar street, every building, every corner of the city seemed alien. And yet, for the first time in days, I felt a strange clarity. Samuel had prepared me for this. He had created a path through the storm my father thought he controlled. As I stepped into the elevator, my phone buzzed again. This time, the message came from my father. The next stage, I realized, would be unavoidable: confrontation. Not with anger, but with truth. He would have to face the consequences of underestimating both me and my grandfather. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the inheritance, not as fortune, but as trust, as guidance, as justice delivered quietly and cleverly. And in that moment, I understood, Samuel hadn't left a company behind. He had left clarity, strategy, and a way to expose character in those who believed they were untouchable. The morning after Eric's call, I woke with a quiet determination I hadn't felt in years. The world outside seemed ordinary, but I knew it had shifted beneath my feet. Every familiar street, every neighbor, every memory tied to my childhood home now carried a different weight. I started with small steps. Emails from the board, polite inquiries from department heads, and messages from staff I barely knew, each carried a careful undertone, a curiosity mixed with respect. They knew something had changed. They knew that for the first time, I held the authority to intervene, to ask questions, to guide decisions. I moved slowly, deliberately. I reviewed files, financial reports, and operational notes, trying to understand not just the mechanics of the company, but the culture my grandfather had built. There was a rhythm to Grant Builders, a balance between efficiency and care that Robert had never noticed. And I wanted to honor it. Then came the first call from my father. I hesitated, knowing this wouldn't be a simple conversation. When I answered, his voice was measured but strained. "Olivia." "Eric told me everything," he began. I didn't understand. I stayed calm, letting the words hang between us. This wasn't a moment for anger or guilt. It was a moment for clarity. "You acted," I said softly, "and you triggered the clause. The board has started the formal review. Until it's complete, operational authority over the estate is temporarily mine." There was a long silence. I could almost hear the life he had built in his mind beginning to unravel. I thought I had more time," he admitted finally. "I never imagined," his voice trailed off, uncertainty replacing the certainty I had always seen. I didn't respond immediately. I let him sit with that truth. Then I said, "This isn't about punishment. It's about responsibility. About honoring the promises Samuel left behind." The conversation ended quietly. No anger, no accusations. Just the subtle shift of understanding. He would have to face consequences, not in dramatic confrontation, but in the relentless precision of the law and the oversight now placed in my hands. By afternoon, I was in the office again. Eric walked me through protocols, compliance measures, operational authority, oversight responsibilities. Each paragraph in the documents felt heavier as I realized the responsibility wasn't just about protecting myself, it was about ensuring that every aspect of the estate, every employee, every client, continued without disruption. I called department heads individually. I asked questions. I listened more than I spoke. And slowly, I began to see what Samuel had seen in me all those years. I wasn't just the alternate beneficiary, I was someone capable of guiding, balancing, and observing with care. Meanwhile, messages from my father became less frequent. He wasn't ignoring the situation. He was adjusting to it, learning in real time the consequences of choices made without foresight. Taylor stayed quiet as well, her usual confidence muted by the shift she hadn't anticipated. That evening, I sat alone in the office, reviewing documents and plans, the city lights casting a soft glow through the tall windows. It was surreal. I wasn't celebrating wealth. I wasn't reveling in power. I was carrying a responsibility carefully entrusted to me by a man who understood the character of those around him far better than they understood themselves. And slowly, I began to understand something else. The inheritance was never about money. It was about values. About judgment. About holding people accountable when they believe they are untouchable. Samuel had set the stage not for revenge, but for clarity. By the end of the week, small victories became apparent. Staff responded with respect, communication lines opened, and operational decisions started to flow without disruption. My father reached out one more time, less with expectation and more with inquiry. He asked questions, listened, and for the first time, deferred. I realized then that the lessons my grandfather had taught me were unfolding exactly as he intended. The responsibility, the trust, the attention to detail, all of it was a reflection of the man he was, the values he lived by, and the legacy he wanted to preserve. I had survived the shock, the betrayal, and the displacement. Now, I was moving into purpose. Not as a daughter, not as a competitor, but as a guardian of what mattered. And in that moment, I understood, control, authority, and wealth meant nothing without wisdom, patience, and a commitment to what is right. Samuel hadn't just left me documents or instructions. He had left me the tools to see the truth. And for the first time, I felt ready to act on it. The days that followed felt almost unreal. Every familiar routine, every expectation my father had clung to, had begun to unravel, and I was at the center of it. Not because I sought power, but because Samuel had planned it this way. I started receiving updates from the board. Robert Bennett's actions were being scrutinized. His decision to remove me from the house without cause had triggered an automatic review. Each report highlighted a breach of responsibility, failure to provide stability, lack of consideration for my well-being, and clear disregard for the conditions outlined in Samuel's will. It was fascinating, in a quiet, almost surgical way, to watch the man who had spent decades building his life on control realize that control could slip through his fingers. For the first time, he faced a system designed not by luck, but by foresight and intention. Taylor stayed on the periphery. She was cautious now, observing, unsure where her loyalties should lie. The entitlement that had been second nature to her felt suddenly fragile, replaced with the uncertainty of circumstance she had never experienced. Meanwhile, my own life had shifted dramatically. I wasn't just watching events unfold, I was actively steering them. Operational authority meant oversight, approving budgets, reviewing contracts, ensuring employees had clear guidance. I had to learn quickly, but I also had an advantage that no one else could touch. I knew the heartbeat of Grant Builders because I had grown up surrounded by its people and its work ethic. Meetings became a new form of education. I asked questions that revealed hidden processes, identified inefficiencies, and listened more than I spoke. Slowly, department heads began to respect my voice, not because of wealth or title, but because they recognized thoughtfulness, consistency, and clarity. The transition wasn't smooth, it never would be. But it was happening. One afternoon, Eric called with an update. "The board has formally acknowledged the breach," he said. "Robert's authority is being limited pending further review. Your operational oversight is official." I absorbed the news quietly. I didn't feel triumph. I felt responsibility. And yet, I couldn't help a subtle recognition of justice. A man who had treated me as disposable was now compelled to act with integrity. Later that day, I met Robert in a neutral office, the same one where we had begun our difficult conversations. He looked different. The armor of certainty and control had been stripped away. There was no anger, no manipulation, only a cautious attempt to gauge what could be salvaged. I didn't understand," he said again, echoing the words he had spoken days before. But now, they were accompanied by genuine concern, fear even. He wasn't asking for permission or negotiation. He was confronting the consequences of his choices. I remained calm. "The process is underway," I reminded him. "Everything depends on adherence to Samuel's provisions. This isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility." For the first time, he seemed to see me, not as a nuisance, not as an obstacle, but as someone whose judgment mattered. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Taylor approached me soon after, hesitantly. Her usual bravado had waned. I want to understand," she admitted. "I don't want to be left out." We talked, carefully. Slowly, a bridge began to form. Not a return to childhood rivalry, but a cautious recognition that things could be different. Samuel had left me clarity, and now, I was beginning to see the possibility of rebuilding connections, not on entitlement, but on truth. By the end of the week, the changes were tangible. Policies and procedures were realigned, employees responded with respect, and the company's operations stabilized. Robert and Taylor were adjusting to new boundaries. And I, for the first time, truly understood the power of intention. Samuel hadn't left us with money alone. He had left a structure that revealed character, that tested integrity, that showed who would rise with responsibility and who would falter under expectation. And in this shift, I found a strange kind of peace. Because for the first time in decades, the family's dynamics were no longer dictated by fear, by greed, or by assumption. They were dictated by action, by accountability, by the values that Samuel had lived and trusted me to uphold. Months passed, but the tension never fully disappeared. The legal and procedural processes surrounding the estate moved deliberately, meticulously, leaving no room for shortcuts. Every signature, every audit, every board meeting was a step toward the formal transfer of authority, a process that confirmed the wisdom of Samuel's planning. By the time the final approvals were signed, I had settled into a rhythm. Operational control was no longer temporary. The company, the estate, the legacy of decades of work, all of it rested on my shoulders. I carried it quietly, deliberately, understanding that stewardship required more than authority, it required patience, discernment, and care. Robert watched, adapting slowly. The man who had once dismissed me, who had cast me out with a single phrase, now approached with caution. His tone was measured, and his questions reflected a desire to rebuild, to understand rather than command. I didn't immediately forgive, but I recognized effort. Healing is rarely instant, it arrives in careful increments. Taylor, too, began to shift. The competition and rivalry that had defined her behavior for so long softened under the reality that the future wasn't guaranteed by assumption or proximity, it was earned through responsibility. Our conversations grew more frequent, more genuine. We weren't returning to the past, but we were beginning to construct something new, a tentative connection built on honesty, accountability, and shared respect. Through it all, I thought of Samuel. His guidance had not been loud or dramatic. It had been subtle, precise, intentional. He had observed character, understood weaknesses, and created structures that would reveal truth even in the absence of his presence. And now, as the legal framework executed his vision, I began to see the depth of his foresight. I met with department heads, employees, and clients. I listened, learned, and implemented changes where necessary. Each decision, each careful adjustment, reflected the values Samuel had instilled: integrity, responsibility, empathy, and the courage to act wisely even when circumstances were uncomfortable. The company's operations stabilized, not because I sought control, but because I approached my role as steward rather than conqueror. And slowly, the family dynamics shifted in subtle, meaningful ways. My father began to recognize the consequences of his past choices, not as punishment, but as education. He approached me with less expectation and more willingness to understand, to cooperate, and to respect the boundaries Samuel had embedded in the inheritance. Taylor, too, grew into a new awareness. The lessons of accountability, fairness, and humility were not abstract concepts anymore, they were lived experiences. She and I developed a tentative understanding, a fragile but honest foundation for connection that hadn't existed before. I visited Samuel's grave one quiet morning. Fresh flowers in hand, I stood in the soft sunlight, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. I thought of the legacy he left, not the money, not the company, not the estate, but the clarity, the principles, and the courage to act with integrity when no one is watching. I realized then that inheritance is not about possession. It is about trust, responsibility, and the opportunity to see truth. Samuel had entrusted me not with wealth, but with discernment. He had built a structure that demanded character, foresight, and resilience, and in doing so, he had left a blueprint for how to live with clarity, courage, and care. As I turned to leave, the sun catching the edges of the headstone, I felt a calm I hadn't known since the day I was pushed out of the house. The storm had passed. The tests had been met. And the family, fragile as it remained, was on a path toward understanding, guided not by greed or fear, but by the quiet, enduring lessons of the man who had seen farther than any of us. I had survived betrayal, displacement, and shock. And in the aftermath, I understood that strength is measured not by what is given, but by what you choose to rise from. Samuel's gift was not the estate. It was clarity, justice, and the unshakable truth that character defines legacy. Standing there, I whispered a silent thank you. And for the first time in my life, I felt the full weight and the full grace of his trust.